Hi there, everybody. I'm John Atack still, despite everything. And this is my dear, dear friend, Hoyt Richards. Hi,
Hello,
Hoyt.
John. Nice to see you.
And since last we spoke, which was a while ago, have we spoken since the wedding in July? It's
Not like this. No, we haven't. No.
terrible. I actually managed to watch a movie you were in called
Oh,
Inter,
good.
and it's available on Vimeo, and I absolutely recommend it. I really thought your performance was flawless. Absolutely.
Oh, well, you're very kind. Thank you.
And it's a fascinating idea that the movie's based upon too. So Vimeo, intersection, Hoyt Richards.
Well,
Um,
thank you.
and we, before we started up, we were talking about recovery. And let me start out by saying that there is no prescription for recovery for somebody who's been in an authoritarian group. You don't have a
Right.
set of steps that you go through, and the end of it, you come out all shiny clean. It's also true that a percentage of people, I've seen it reported at 16%, but I don't know what the study was, are resilient. And it doesn't matter what you do to them, it's water off a duck's back. So there's a small proportion of people who are resilient and won't take so much time in recovery. I've just come off a conversation with Aaron Smith Levin, who was 4 years old when his parents got into Scientology, and he then went through the whole thing, and he says he didn't really have to recover. He's fine. So that can happen. I wouldn't bet on it.
I think I would agree with you there, John. I think I haven't met too many of those resilient types, and I admire them, and I guess on some level I'm jealous of them. But yeah, I certainly would say the plethora of the people I've experienced and consider to be comrades in this journey and friends, have experienced a lot of trauma, and it's not an easy path. And I think the one of the great misconceptions out there that hopefully is starting to be dispelled is the fact that the aftermath, in many ways, is far more challenging than the actual experience of being in the cultic control group. In a sense, while you're in the group, a lot of things are fairly simple as far as you've been groomed to believe some form of black and white thinking. So things are kind of cut and dry as far as whether you're succeeding or failing. And more often than not, you're failing.
No.
I would say I would put that at the high percentage of a less than 16% success rate. You're talking about the resilience. I'd say you're usually in the high 90s of failure rate of when you're in these things. So you're constantly feeling that what you're doing is wrong, or that there's something wrong with you, or that you're not giving enough, and that you're constantly feeling diminished or even quite often demeaned in many ways and feeling lesser than. And so it's very cut and dry in that sense.
Reading Mike Rinder's Billion Years, which is an excellent book.
Oh, I'm looking forward to reading that as well. Yeah.
He comes back to the same point again and again, that he believed. And so an instance where Hubbard actually disciplines him for something he hasn't done. But he says, well, Hubbard can see deeply inside me, and so I need disciplining.
Yeah, I know. And that's a fascinating phenomenon. I know it's probably hard for people to imagine how you get to that place. And I think the more people like a Mike Rinder, and I try to do this myself, I have found that in telling the story, the more that you can represent your mindset at that time, even though it paints a really bad picture of yourself, because it's not a very complimentary mindset to be in, and it's one that's, you could say, is quite embarrassing or even shameful to admit it happened. But the truth is, the more you take ownership of that experience, and the more that you can really, to the best of your ability, replicate it to another, to understand this is how I used to think and how my mind used to work, the more forgiving people are, because it's through that deeper understanding that people start to go, oh, now I can understand how it happened. Whereas before, I just thought you had to be crazy, or this person, there's something wrong with this person. But if you can really paint the picture and say, yes, I believed, like myself, I believed the end of the world was coming. I thought the spaceships were going to come down and somehow save us and then put us in rejuvenation chambers and train us, and we were going to come back and repopulate the earth. As ludicrous and as bad kind of science fiction as that is, that actually was my operating, mentality. So when the stakes are that kind of high, in the sense that you think the end of the world is coming, and that somehow you've been chosen to be one of the ones that survive because you have a higher purpose to kind of play in what the future of the planet is. Again, as crazy as that sounds, it puts your life in such an extreme kind of state of importance that you just walk on eggshells, and the so-called leader who's guiding you through this minefield, their word becomes like God's in that sense. And you feel they're the ones leading you towards this great destiny that you would have never imagined on your own, you would have ever been possibly living out. So all of that really puts you in a state, and because I was watching this episode last night of The Vow. They're in the second season, and there's a girl that at a certain point, because she's being punished, they put her in this room where there's just like a small futon, nothing else, no light, nothing, and she basically stays in there for, I think, 2 years, and the door is not locked, but it's very clear that this is her punishment. She has been given a writing pad, and she's supposed to write apology letters to the cult leader about how terrible she's been and how she's going to make things better. And he's going to then let her know when she has basically finished her punishment. And it goes on for 2 years until she finally decides to leave. And then, the prosecution is basically saying, well, if the door is open, then why did you leave? It's not like you were really trapped. And that's what people need to understand. You are trapped. I mean, you become your own worst enemy. Like in my personal story, I was traveling 300 days a year. And so you could easily say, well, you weren't being that affected by the cult because you were out amongst the world most of the time. But the truth is, once you know the rules of the situation you're in, you become your own worst prison guard. I knew that I was supposed to be behaving a certain way out there in the world, and that obviously, for the most part, I wasn't able to live up to that standard because that standard was completely unrealistic.
Yeah.
But because that was the accepted form that we're all supposed to kind of do in this mindset we all had, I would have to check in every day with the group, and I would have to report back on how I performed that day. And of course, on some level, I would be complicit, or at least I would try to be as transparent to some degree that I had not been completely perfect that day, but I would not probably be as accurate as I really was, where I failed quite miserably in my attempts. But I had to kind of spin doctor it to not get in too much trouble, but feel like I could tell enough that at least I would sell it to them that I was being honest. And the truth was, I wasn't being honest. And when you're kind of being deceptive, that always has like a little Pac-Man effect on your soul. You're not being honest with the people you say you're supposed to be, your spiritual family, your friends, whatever way you frame it. And that really had a long-term negative effect on me. And that's where these type of dynamics, when I try to talk about them, I try to explain to people, not only is it hard to live through that, but when you come to the realization that that's what's going on and that's what happened, it's an incredibly traumatic experience to not only go through it, but then to realize what it was, and then try to say to yourself, well, how am I going to make sense of this, not only for myself, but for all the people that have been concerned and are my friends or family and loved ones who are just looking at me with those bug eyes going, what the fuck happened? How do I explain that to them? And that is so much more difficult than just the cult life where you're just trying. I tell people I was in one of two states. I was either about to be in trouble or I was in trouble.
Yeah.
So I had lost sense of what a good day was, where I didn't have any worries about that. It was either I'm walking on eggshells because at any point I'm going to expose and I'm going to get in trouble, or I was in trouble and trying to mitigate what punishment it would be and how we get through the day. And just was there any way to stop the punishment or stop being in trouble and at least get to the point where I could just kind of put my tail between my legs and run off and do whatever chores or things they had dictated I needed to do to kind of make amends.
Yeah.
And there I am. There's my there's my pitch on why I think these things are really challenging, and I wish people could understand, and I think it's important that we have conversations like we're having now, and you're seeing more and more of it, of what does that recovery process look like, how is it unfolding, and there is no set formula, like you said. There's no, each person's different. I have found if I can make one broad generalization, and I think I see people when they come to grips with the more accurate reality of what their experience was intellectually, through getting, whether it's information on cults or information on mind control or manipulation, you can intellectually connect the dots and say, oh, this is what happened to me. This is the technique that was used on me. This is how I became brainwashed, or this is how I was manipulated. But the emotional processing of that experience is a really much longer journey. So that's also a difficult period where you can say, okay, I think I can understand what happened, but it's another thing to say, well, how would I really feel about that? And how can I process it in such a way where I can own it and explain it to someone else in terms that I feel is accurate or authentic to what I really experienced? Because and I certainly know for myself in the beginning, I didn't even really know what I experienced. I just knew it was something bad, but I couldn't really articulate it very well.
Yeah.
So,
yeah, absolutely. At the center of that, I mean, one of the significant tools for understanding about our experience is Robert J. Lifton's 8 deadly sins of thought reform, which he wasn't thinking about in cult terms. He was talking to people who'd survived the brainwashing program in China. And,
that's right.
And the Chinese call it brainwashing before anybody wants to get into an argument about the use of the word in that context, sinao, the washing of the brain. He puts forward the demand for purity as one of his 8 points. And that sort of setting impossible standards that you'll never be able to live up to, so that guilt will be induced in you, so that you are always looking at what you are doing wrong, rather than looking at the leadership, which is doing things that are 100 times worse than anything you're doing generally. So, and I think there's a context here that we tend in our modern pluralistic world to think that cults are something novel. Whereas in fact, when we look back through history, cults are fundamental to
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
you go back through to the Puritans, if we're going to talk about the demand for purity, and something like the Salem witch trials, which are quite evidently utterly bizarre from a contemporary perspective. A bunch of girls start saying that people are possessed by demons, they're seeing all sorts of things, and a trial leads to executions. There are many such trials. About 10,000 people were burned as witches in Europe along the way. And often the accusations came from children. But they're living in a culture where certain things are known to be true, where people are certain of things because that's the way it is. So first, whether the aliens are going to come and help us out, the idea of the end days has been with every generation of Christians, that Jesus said that he would return within the lifetime of the disciples. And we're thinking one of them must have lived a very long life.
Yes.
And then you look at the imposition of rules on people among the Puritans. No dancing, no singing, no enjoying yourself. Sex, well, only when you've got written permission and through a hole in a sheet. That you just have this lifestyle that is crippling And so the failure to live up to it, look at the imposition of celibacy, which I think Buddhism is the first group to decide to use, and then the Christians get it as well. You won't find it in Islam. You won't find it in mainstream Hinduism, I don't think, or Jainism, or Judaism. But put forward this rule that says you mustn't have sex and you mustn't think about sex.
Right.
That's a good one. So that means that just about every day you're guilty.
Yeah.
For having a probably quite normal feeling about something. If you can then add to that the foods that you're meant to eat and not eat, we at the moment are living in an incredible cultic environment with regard to what we're told about nutrition. And I'm now reading the second book by Professor Tim Spector, who designed the largest nutritional survey the world's ever known, nearly 5 million people during the COVID-19 epidemic. Against the wishes of government here, they tried to close him down. But he said, if we can find out what people are doing nutritionally, we may find out ways of having better resistance to viruses and better recovery. And they did indeed find that on the sort of diet he's looking at, people are less likely to get COVID-19 and will recover better. Right. That's one of many studies he's been involved with. He's published 900 papers. He's a professor of genetic epidemiology, so what genes have to do with the spread of disease. And he's come up with incredibly well-researched material showing that what our governments are telling us at the moment about food and health is not true. So the low-fat diet is not true. Having to eat fish is not true. Vitamin and mineral supplements are not useful. That, based on huge surveys, they don't really work. So your fish oil capsules, which bring in tens of billions of dollars a year, are a waste of time. Taking salt will give you high blood pressure. Not true. I'm sort of going, no, hang on a minute. This is getting we're going a bit too far here. I'm experiencing cognitive dissonance. He gives the evidence for everything he's saying. He's not some, quack who's off at the side. He's basically saying, we have been led to believe these things. And the same is true in any culture and any society, that there'll be a set of beliefs, and then there's the demand for purity. You should be eating salmon every week. Well, no, actually, you probably shouldn't, because of the problem with fish lice. And we don't want to put people off their salmon here, but you're allowed 3 per fish. And that's still fine. That's still fine. So any subject that we deal with, there are cultural presumptions about. And when it comes to the end days, Armageddon, it's a commonplace thought in our society. It's been pumped out generation after generation. The end of the world is nigh. And you had it in your group. I had it in Scientology, where Hubbard was, I want Scientologists to survive World War III. And so they have, but not through doing anything he said. And things become commonplaces. What then happens is that we look at other people who believe something else. And there'll doubtless been some hackles raised by what I've just said about nutrition. So Tim Spector.
Well, what's interesting to me is when you talk about nutrition, what's his name again?
Professor Tim Spector. He's at King's College London.
Okay, yeah, because when you think about the whole COVID thing, and this, and I think this goes back to even AIDS, right? Like you're talking about illnesses that affect the immune system, and yet the lack of emphasis on, well, what are the preventative things nutrition-wise we could do to strengthen our immune system? Like it's so logical that you would say, well, could I eat something that would enhance the strength of my immune system? This illness, whatever it is affecting my immune system. How do I strengthen my immune system? Whether it's through food, through exercise, whatever those things might be. Clearly, there's been information and studies about that. Why does that never become the focus? Why does it always become something, we have to come up with the right drug or pharmaceutical answer, which again, big business, yes. So yeah, it's remarkable, and it slides as well into most organized religions. It's this this same sort of thing of we there's this total lack of humility of just saying, well, there's certain things we just don't know, and we're doing our best to figure out, but you have to accept on some level that there's a lot out there that we just don't know. These organizations seem to be compelled to always say, I have the solution. Here's what you need to do. There's no doubt this is safe and effective. End of story. And, after having gone through something like I've gone through, that's generally when my bullshit detector goes off. And I'm like, you can't deal with these absolutes. It's just not the way the world's really wired. And it makes me initially suspicious and skeptical, which I'm glad.
Yeah.
But I certainly watch, having gone through something like I went through, I watch how easily in these other areas like you're talking about, whether it's nutrition, whether it's about the way pharmaceuticals operate, that there's so many cultic aspects to the way these things are being sold, and the way that you're clearly manipulating the populace through fear, indoctrination, to compel them to do something which generally the bottom line is money, more often than not, rather than the general health and care for people.
Yep.
Or just even giving someone the opportunity to have what's called informed consent, right? Like, just give them the information and let people make up their minds for themselves. It's a much more dictatorial point of view. Like, you have to trust us. We have all the answers. Here's the answer. And if you don't follow what we say, you are therefore bad.
Yeah, absolutely. And so much we have to depend upon authorities. We if I have a virus, then it could well be that a doctor could do something helpful.
Right.
If I break my leg, a surgeon is probably a better person to go to than a decorator. But then if I want my house decorating, the surgeon may be useless at that. So,
right.
So people develop competences and skills, but there is a dreadful problem in terms of authority that we're not taught at school how to determine whether something is true or not. We're not taught how to vet our authorities to say, I've been lucky. I'm not as lucky now. My doctor's retired, actually, and he didn't ask my permission. But I still have a really good dentist, have a really good plumber, have a pretty good electrician. The basic things of life, people who are not going to mess the job up.
Right.
And part of that is through a certain attitude of mind. When I was 22 years old, I'd had an abscess on a tooth. And I went to my family dentist, who I'd seen from childhood onward, and he told me that it was as a consequence of a dentist having made an error that I had this problem, and the tooth would have to come out. And I said to him, and I was a Scientologist at the time, so
Yeah,
I said
right.
to him, I think I'd like a second opinion. And he was, well, what will happen is that your sinuses will be damaged if you don't have this tooth taken out. You'll have terrible sinusitis. And he then went and complained to the family practitioners committee that he didn't want me as a patient anymore. I went to another dentist, and the gold cap that he put in lasted 20 years. I don't have sinusitis. And I discovered that my family dentist, right from me being a child, was an alcoholic.
Oh, geez.
If a dentist had in fact caused damage to that particular tooth, it was him. So, but it was incredible, the resistance, from this authority figure. He knew what he was doing. How dare I challenge him? And I wasn't being unpleasant. I was just saying, I think, and we all too often submit to somebody who appears to know what they're talking about. And that's true very much in matters of religion and politics. Seeing the present divide in the US between the political parties, and to me, absolutely remarkable idea that anybody believes a word that Donald J. Trump says, given that he's been shown on more than 1,500 occasions to have made material up. It's not true. And yet there is an emotional connection, there is an attachment to this man and something he represents. The problem with the world is it's being run by billionaires. Let's make one president. How does that solve the problem?
Well, the thing you brought up, and I'd love to kind of expand upon a little bit, when you said, how does someone really vet the truth, right? Like how, what's a systematic approach? And I'd be curious to get your insight on because I look at that area and I think whatever that potential system might be would be so great to be taught in schools when you're maybe just becoming a teenager, 12, 13, 14. You're given like, here's a commonsensical approach to, if you're suspicious or skeptical about something, here's a way you could potentially vet how truthful these statements or this person or this situation is. And I'd love to get your thoughts on what that might look like.
Well, I agree with you. That's exactly the age when we should be teaching it. And in my spare time, I'm working on a curriculum for UK schools. And we've roughed out 12 lessons, and one of them has to be about this. So the first place I would go, I think every school teacher in the world should read Intelligent Disobedience by Ira Chaleff. Ira has been, he's been awarded a traveling fellowship from Cambridge University here. So his work is held in high regard. And he points out that he was giving a talk one day and a woman in the audience stopped him and said, under the desk, I have what you're talking about. And he was sort of, what? And she was training a guide dog. And she said, guide dogs have to learn intelligent disobedience. Why don't we teach it to children? If you're a guide dog with a blind person and they're going to walk into something, you have to stop them. You have to be disobedient. You have to say no. And to teach that to children, to say that obedience in a slave state or in a military state like North Korea, obedience is a necessity. In a cult group, obedience is a necessity. But to create a harmonious society, disobedience is a good idea. I had a conversation with a friend the other week, and he told me that he was woke. And I said, oh, not really into that particular label. And he said, well, if you're not woke, you're a fascist. Now, this is one of the most intelligent people I know.
Wow. And again, that's pure black and white thinking, boy, right there. Huh?
Yeah. And so I had to say to him, I'm not woke and I'm not a fascist. What are you going to do with me?
Yeah, right.
And not, one of the problems we have is the kind of flocking or swarming nature of human beings, the herd nature.
Yeah.
We will tend to believe things because we like the source of them, because we feel some attachment. And of course, underneath that, the thing to teach is about feelings of knowing, the sense of certainty.
Right.
I've told the story many times, but I had a couple of hours with a born-again Christian when I was 17, and eventually he backed away from me, scared. I don't know what I'd said. And, he looked at me and he said, I don't understand the Bible, but I know it's all true. Well, that's not knowledge. That's a feeling of certainty. And so much of what we believe comes from that, not from evidence. And so then the next thing is teaching a scientific approach, so that what you want is evidence. And we get in some very crazy areas with this. So a professor at Columbia called Carl Hart, who wrote a book called Drug Use for Grown-Ups. And it's an incredible story. He grew up in the projects in Florida. He joined the Marines. He went on the GI Bill. He got through his doctorate. And he had been told that Black people, such as himself in the projects, their lives were being ruined by drugs. And so he spent 10 years researching the effects of drugs to expose this and do something about it. Unfortunately, and he's at Columbia University, unfortunately, he couldn't find the evidence that was being put forward. So he then spent the next 10 years researching further and basically saying, so much of this information is made up and it's apocryphal. So a simple instance, I've never taken PCP. I have no wish to take angel dust PCP.
Right.
But it is a common myth that it gives people superhuman power. So you think that the military would definitely be using it, nothing gives people superhuman power. It's also a common myth that it makes people aggressive. And Carhart says there is no single study that shows this. And then he points at the way that a study of, I think it was 20 people with regard to a part of the brain being smaller in people who didn't use cannabis, in people who did use cannabis than it is in people who don't. 20 people.
Right.
No measurement before they started using cannabis. And he then says, same time, there was a gold standard study of more than 1,000 people, which said, well, cannabis appears to have beneficial effects. That was done by a guy who was working for the US government on drug matters, and it was not publicized at all. So you have this slant of, this is what we believe, and here's a study of 7 mice that says it's true. So one of the things you're looking for is an authority who, exactly as you says, has humility, and who's saying, we don't know this. Tim Spector basically says, we don't really know. What we can say with some certainty is that processed meats, chicken nuggets and burgers and things like that, are bad for you. And there is very good evidence for that. On the other hand, red meat, which is even the World Health Organization has gone up against, the evidence actually doesn't support the idea that it's carcinogenic, despite the World Health Organization's pronouncements. So there are some things, his fundamental advice is eat as many different plants as possible, and prefer vegetables over fruits in that, but eat as many fruits and vegetables, nuts, pulses, rice, what have you, as you can. And his studies, which are huge, show that your health will be better. But beyond that, they're still trying to work out what the microbiome is doing in the gut, which bacteria are good for us.
And you also said he said that there's not much evidence that like vitamins and supplements help strengthen the system. So
yeah, they help. Vitamins and minerals help the system, but in supplement form, they're largely not digested.
I see, yeah. So it's what form can you assimilate or not, right?
Yeah, and I mean the currently in this country, most doctors will test for vitamin D deficiencies, and about 40% of people in the UK have vitamin D deficiencies. And he says they do, but taking vitamin D or D3, cholecalciferol or ergocalciferol, there is no evidence that this is useful. Now, he's a guy who's been studying osteoporosis for 30 years. So he knows about calcium and vitamin D. And he's saying, we've done studies and it just doesn't bear this out. You need to get it from your food, because that way it will be assimilated. It'll have everything it needs to get into your system. Again, the idea of full fat milk.
Right.
He's very much for full fat milk. He's particularly for unpasteurized cheeses, which he says carry microbes that are really good for our digestion and may explain what's been called the French paradox, which is that for some reason, the bounders who live in France live for, on average, 4 years longer than people in my nation. And yet they eat huge amounts of cheese and they drink red wine. And he's saying, well, it could be the microbes in the cheese that are creating a healthy digestion. It's worth saying also, of course, that your microbiome massively affects your mood. And so, yeah, I think we can probably agree that eating huge amounts of sugar, processed sucrose sugar, or even taking it in huge amounts of fruit as fructose, it will not only damage the enamel in your teeth through the black bacteria, but it will also influence the microbiome. So, this gets us into the question of authority. I like Tim Spector because A, he's a professor at a highly rated university, King's College in London. B, he's published 900 papers. he's headed studies. One of the particular studies was about, he studied identical twins and fraternal twins for a long period of time. And he came out, after studying in his own work and through other people's work, thousands of people, and said, oh, very interesting. Identical twins, here they are in adulthood. One of them is vegan, not sure.
Yeah.
And the other eats at McDonald's every day, and yet they are the same shape and size. So that was the first thing to say. There's a genetic inclination towards a particular shape.
Right.
And so making people who are considered overweight guilty has not, which is all that we've achieved in the last 40 years of propaganda on this subject.
Yeah.
I saw this great thing with a sociologist who spent 2 years in Wales in the 1970s monitoring the British government's advice about obesity and diet. And he said that in 2 years study, the only change he saw because of this advertising campaign was that people who were considered fat were picked on. You should, get willpower up. Beyond that, he said, well, what we can change is the microbiome, so we can increase the amount of, say, Akkermansia in the system, which is the gut cleaner. And the way you do that is by doing the 16-hour fast, where you've got your 8 hours of sleep and you've got 4 hours, so that 16 hours is enough time for them to get in and clean things out. And they will then be protective against harmful bacteria. We know that Christensenella is only found in 1 in 10 people. And those people will all be thin.
Oh, wow.
How? But again, to try and supplement these things, to try and, with yogurt, about 1% of the bacteria survives the transit through your stomach.
Right.
But, he says, good thing to eat it, but you have to eat it every day and you have to be sure it's live and not packed with sugar or, fruit flavorings or things which are generally not good for us. So he pushes towards a natural diet and dispels the fear and guilt that are built into these things, unless, of course, you're eating too much dessert, which I know you're not. So an authority is somebody who has a reputation, who has done the work, and who gives good footnotes. And in the nutrition field, you have the evil Adele Davis. In Scientology, we had to read her books. Let's Eat Right to Keep Fit.
Right.
He was the subject of a trial where it came out that though her books were packed with footnotes, she employed people simply to look up vitamin D or something and list all the papers. She didn't read them. They didn't come into her work. So it's not just footnotes, it's saying that the text is connected. And that I because of Adele Davis, when I left Scientology, I went and read, what are the mainstream standard texts on these subjects? So I read a book by a London professor of nutrition, where, for example, in Scientology, people take several grams of vitamin C a day. Not a habit I ever got, but I talked with Ben Corridon a few years ago, who's wrote a book about Hubbard, L. Ron Hubbard, Messiah or Madman. And he came and stayed in my house, and he told me he was taking 10 grams of vitamin C a day, and he saw my jaw drop. Now, we in Scientology were trained in the deadpan look.
Right.
So it's quite unusual for me to go, oh,
Yeah, right.
10 grams a day. I said, well, the recommended daily allowance of vitamin C is 180 milligrams. It's a strong acid, so it will burn the lining of your stomach.
Yeah.
And what's more, you'll be pissing out anything that you don't need. So if you stop taking it, you might get scurvy because your body is rejecting vitamin C. It's easy to check. You check how much vitamin C there is in your urine. And so just a simple thing like that, coming from somebody who's an authority on the subject and looking at different, where there's any contention, seeing what the different perspectives are. Usually the cultic mentality, you join QAnon and that's the truth now.
Right.
Or you join, some ultra sect of Christianity or Judaism or what have you, and that's the truth now. Being able to look outside your bubble, being able to look at what other people feel.
And encouraging debate, right? I mean, basically saying, listen, if I really believe this, to the best of my ability, seems to be truthful, one of the best ways to test the veracity is to continually have it debated and tested by other points of view, because in theory, that would be the process that would allow it to keep rising to the top. And then you hopefully say, okay, well, it seems to be, and still keeping open the potential that someone may come and disprove it. But so far as my research has shown and all the debates I've had, this seems to be the way I lean, but not to become definitive and say, oh, well, this is it. I can now stop taking in any information about this. This is now, solidified in stone, and you can move on. I think that's a real danger with anything.
I couldn't agree more. Socrates and Lao Tzu both pointed out that people who know don't know anything, and that people
right, exactly, right.
And certainly, when I was 18, I had a vast repository of knowledge, and now at the age of 67, I realize I know so very little. Because I have a kind of magpie mind, people sometimes mistakenly think that I know a great deal. It's not true. But
well, you are incredibly well read. You must at least own that side of things. You've definitely done your research. Yeah,
I've met people who've read more than I have. A lot more than I have. It's a matter of synthesizing and being able to articulate what we've read. I have read a few books, I admit it. And I'm a slow reader. I read.
right.
It takes me about 2 weeks to read a book. So I read 25 books a year. But I seem to have this automatic process. It's fascinated me. I can come back and watch an episode of CSI or something that I've seen, and I don't remember anything in it. It's just I haven't bothered to store it.
Retain it, yeah.
Whereas somehow there's some little being inside my brain that says, well, that's more relevant. Let's push that to the forward. And it's an unconscious process.
Well,
I don't actually believe there are any little beings in my head, by the way. So.
No, I know. No, I mean, on a daily basis, I experience that just, where I live. Unfortunately, I have to park on the street. So you're depending on what the parking is with the other people, I can park in a variety. It's all walking distance. But very often, if I don't, after I park my car, just take that little bean and make a mental note. Oh, this is where I am. If I just park and head back to my place the next morning, I have no clue where I parked, and I have to go through I'm like, was it? And I literally have to find my car. But if I make that one little mental note at that moment and say, oh, it's here, then the next morning I have no problem. So we have the mechanism. It's just whether we utilize it or not. I think, and this is where I kind of wonder. I'm looking into some things right now around AI and how AI works and how to make AI a functioning tool for mankind. Rather, like I'm very much, for me philosophically, I'm against the idea of this transhumanism of where we're going to blend with technology. I have no interest in being a cyborg. I have no interest in people pursuing that. I think that to me that just sounds dangerous. The people that kind of live in the theory that, oh, the human race is just the interim race to create the
singularity.
The machine race, right? I'm like, I don't want any part of that. Yeah,
no, me neither.
But I do like the idea that if I had a tool, it's not unlike Star Wars where you have a droid, right? Where you have this machine that could somehow get to know you, and then it would just retain more information than your brain can hold because it's a machine that's built that way. It can just store data. So if I wanted to access data of my own behavior that I just can't remember because I can't retain it, then this would be a great tool for me to have. I think
until somebody hacked it, of course, and then you'd be fed memories that you didn't really have, and you'd trust it.
Yeah, well, there you go. That's where you get into the dangerous sci-fi stuff. But I mean, I do find that part of it potentially could be useful. This idea of handing it over to decide our destiny. Yeah, that doesn't sound too great to me. Yeah.
I think we are already cyborgs. I
Yeah.
think it's happened without us noticing. It's a book that our friend Steve Hassan recommended to me by a doctor called Carl Marcy, called Rewired. And he's I believe a psychiatrist, neurologist, who has worked with the advertising industry. And he tells this great story. He says, when the smartphone came in, there was this concern among advertisers that people would, when the ads came on their television, they'd switch to their phone and they wouldn't see the ads. So they wanted to see if the ads were actually effective. And
Okay.
so they separated their two groups. They took the smartphones away from one group and they left the other. And this was 7 or 8 years ago. So not far into the use of the smartphone.
Right.
And he said that what interested him was that in the control group, who had no phones, there was a woman who was obviously very fretful, very nervous, and she left before the experiment was over. She didn't collect, it was 1 hour. She didn't collect her $150, but she couldn't be away from her smartphone. And he's now talking about smartphone addiction.
Yeah.
The influence of say, I know a family where one of the boys committed suicide, having been egged on to, I think 17, having been egged on to do it on social media. And so you have this problem of influence that, and because we don't necessarily see how much AI is actually active, finding out that, Amazon track the site you were at before them and the site you go to. And that just goes into, and Jeff Bezos is going to give all his money away, so it's all fine. How he got the money is the problem I'm having, but anybody could be allowed to have so much power and influence in the world. And I hope he gives some of it to me, despite me saying that about him. Nobody has done so far. That our lives, we are interfaced with AI at all times, and that can be incredibly positive. My two younger boys, one of my brothers said, "Oh, they're spending too much time on the internet." I said, "No, they're not. They are learning so much. They're not, they're finding out things." And so they both have, because they both have incredible memories, they both had a huge repository of information, most of it useful, because they're pursuing the things that interest them rather than being bounced into the next video, which is the other problem with AI, that you're being assessed. And when you've bought, a coffee maker on Amazon, the brilliant AI will then try and sell you another 7 coffee makers.
Right, exactly. Yeah, because it works on a very generalized approach. Rather than being, so it can track your behavior, but it doesn't really know you. And that's where I think if you had something that was more personalized, and then you would only be the one that would access that information, so you'd have some privacy as well. So it becomes your like sidekick that you get to utilize on your own, not unlike a droid, like 3PO or R2D2 in Star Wars. It's your tool to use at your discretion. Then I think it's a potentially serviceable tool. If it's something that continues to, like you're describing, just track us for the main goal to try to enhance our ability to be a consumer, then it doesn't sound very, very interesting to me. But if it could really become a viable tool that obviously could retain more data and information than our brain ever could, and we could access that to our benefit at our discretion, then I think it's something interesting,
It's true. Coming back to the notion of how we deal with information, this scientific method, there are people who have the mistaken notion that science is a cult or a belief system rather than a method of approach. And many of these people are scientists. They've fallen into the trap of believing what they want. I take New Scientist and have done for 30 years now, and it it fascinates me. I mean, I think it's gone down a little bit since the Daily Mail took it over. But the idea that there'll be an interview with a physicist, there's one last week about the metaverse, one of the, the proper thing, the multiple universes and all of this sort of thing. Sorry, the multiverse, not the metaverse.
The multiverse, yes.
Let's get Mark Zuckerberg out of this conversation immediately.
Yeah.
And her views are, unique. She was one of the first people to propose this, and she puts forward a very cogent argument as to why it is so. And I really appreciate that. I do not believe in a multiverse, however, but I think it's wonderful that somebody who is doing research can put forward the idea. As I understand it, what's happening is that mathematically, it makes sense that there will be multiple universes. Practically, as yet, we have no evidence. But what happens in science is, say somebody comes along and says, quanta, electrons, if you separate one from an atom, it will still be entangled. And Einstein comes along and says, I refuse to believe that God plays dice with creation. That was his response to that thought. And then the Bell experiment came along in the 60s, and it showed that, yes, indeed, these electrons, no matter how far you separate them, behave in concert with one another, leading to all kinds of new age nonsense about interconnectedness, which we won't get into here. But as these ideas are put forward, again, Einstein didn't believe in the Big Bang idea. The Big Bang was put forward by a man called Georges Lemaitre, who happened to be a Catholic priest, which is an interesting comment on science and religion. And the Catholic Church, in fact, accepts this idea. The idea of creation at the Big Bang is there's a papal bull that actually says it's okay for Catholics to believe this, which isn't that wonderful? Being told you can or can't believe something, bless them. And their idea, with the papal index was that they would weed out those things like nonsense, and sometimes they got it right. But the thought that this man had to sit down with Einstein for 3 days and explain why he thought there'd been a Big Bang. At the end of 3 days, Einstein said, I agree with you. Yeah. Now, a discussion at that higher level, a mind that brilliant who had to be persuaded, we need to be able to discuss things. We need to shouting at each other through megaphones. We need to be able to listen to what people have to say. John Stuart Mill's On Liberty is the text on this subject, that even when an idiot tells you something for the 3rd time, you should listen, because you may not be as clever as you think you are. When that comes from a mind like John Stuart Mill's, it's worth listening to, because he's a lot more clever than I am. And you can then test things, which is, hey, that's a good idea. You can test things. You can see what the evidence is. You can see what evidence has been collected by others. But by observation and experiment, you will see to some extent how things are working. And as you say, because science is a method, it leads to verification and falsification. And we can find out, so with vitamin D, the reason that vitamin D is massively prescribed now in this country and in the US is because in the 1930s, kids had rickets, bowed legs, because they had too little vitamin D in their diet. That was dealt with by giving them fish oil supplements, which probably don't work, but you might get something out of them, and milk. And that meant that rickets went. But it now became a basic aspect of health that you've got to have this vitamin D level. Now, vitamins only protect you against deficiency from vitamins. And in fact, vitamin D isn't a vitamin, because it's something your own body can create from sunlight. So it's not, something that has to be taken in nutritionally, as other vitamins do. By looking at why something came about, and so often, I think it was Primo Levi talked about going to a factory in the 1950s. It was a paint factory, and they were adding this stuff to the paint. And he said, why are you doing that? This chemical's unnecessary. He said, oh, well, it goes back. We've been doing it for years. Then he remembered that before the Second War, he'd been called in by this factory because their paint was gelling too hard. It was just one batch of paint. And he said, oh, this will be the chemical you put in to stop that from happening. And so he realized it was him that had given them the advice, which they only needed for that specific instance. I think having a flexibility of thinking, one of the things that I definitely have, I love cognitive dissonance. I like it when somebody challenges what I'm thinking, as long as they're reasonably polite about it, so that I have to rethink something, or, you know. And for most of us, we taught to be resistant.
It's like a mental workout, right? I mean, it's good. I mean, it really is. I mean, I find the same thing when someone's coming through with some sort of kind of breakthrough idea, like, well, maybe it's like this. And it's really trying to understand what they're saying, process what they're saying, and be able to articulate it in a way, you know, that, like, I guess that would be the definition of communication. If I'm trying to tell you something, it's not so much that I do such a good job that I feel I'm representing what I'm saying. What's more important is, are you responding in the way that I want you to respond, that demonstrates to me you understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
Right? Like, if I articulate it beautifully, but it doesn't land on you, and you look at me with big eyes as big as saucers saying, like, I don't get it. Well, obviously I'm not communicating very well then. So even in my mind, I thought, well, God, I really represented it really well as far as I can think. That's not necessarily true. So that, I think that whole process of being able to learn to communicate and to be open-minded and to you know, embrace the debate, and can you get on the same page, if nothing else, other than saying, oh, now I at least understand what you're saying. I don't have to agree with it, but I do get what you're going for, or what you're representing, or what your point of view is. I think that's healthy.
Yeah. And you know, behind that, as I say, you know, the Catholic Church has accepted the Big Bang, but there are, you know, we have the idea of intelligent design, creationism as it used to be called, out there. I've seen an interview with a geologist who tried to explain that, yes, you know, in 4004 BC, God created the Grand Canyon and the striation of rocks. It's rather like Bill Hicks talking about, you know, God planting brontosaurus heads to screw us up in some way. That people get into aggressive and irrational arguments. Coming back to QAnon again. And then they will, I've been misquoting this for some time. I've been saying it was Voltaire who said people who believe absurdities will commit atrocities, and Spike diligently went and found that he didn't. He said something that's often been misrepresented as that, but thankfully somebody else did. And it is true. If you believe absurdities, you'll become willing to commit atrocities. If you want to look at what a cult group can do, then the Nazis do provide an incredible example of how a whole population, you know, 45% of medical doctors in Germany joined the Nazi Party. To give some balance of numbers, the Chinese Communist Party at the moment is about 4% of the population. But the Nazis were a lot more popular. When we take apart what they believed, much of which is New Age nonsense, you know, that we're living inside a hollow earth, for example, a few of them believe that, or that the Aryan people of Atlantis lost their electron powers, and that by breeding programs, the Lebensborn program under Himmler, we can regain our supernatural powers. So we'll just be born with them. And
it sounds like a Scientology thing. That's great, you know.
But so many of these ideas just recycle. They, you know, with us, we had to do lots of bizarre exercises to achieve supernatural powers, and it didn't work. You know, because it work.
Well, it's like
a long time ago.
The TM guys who try to levitate, right? And all they need to do is hoppy.
I had an incredible conversation. It's on the channel with Pat Ryan and Joe Kelly.
Right.
Where Pat actually explained the whole hopping process. And it's really mind-boggling that these people actually believe they're flying.
Yeah.
And
And
I interviewed a PMer who had a fractured coccyx from having landed badly.
oh,
That is a very bad thing to have. But,
yeah. Well, you mentioned about these authoritarian organizations. I just watched um, a friend of mine suggested who was brought up Catholic, and he said you have to watch this documentary called The Vatican Girl on Netflix. And so I binged it over the weekend, and it's just there's this girl that goes missing. There's all these suspicions, and they ultimately they don't resolve anything definitively because there's just no evidence, unfortunately, because this girl disappeared. But there are trails in different ways. But the only thing that I came away with, and it's pretty much their premise, is whether you believe it was the mafia involved or you believed it was the Vatican, whether you believe it was some sort of a arbitrary thing that we can't explain, the police. It's clear that all the theories somehow involve the Vatican. And what's very clear is the Vatican will not say anything. And that's which to me says everything, right? So you've got all these different theories that all in some way involve some sort of thing of that the Vatican knows the answer and the Vatican refuses to say. And to me, that is it in a nutshell. If how can you give authority to an organization that demonstrates it can't be transparent?
yeah, and I mean, we look at and it's the largest organization in the world with what, 1.2 billion members, the Catholic Church, way beyond anything else.
Right.
And yet, and I have a generally good feeling about Pope Frank. I think he's better than the last few we've had, but
right.
they were really. So if we look at, say, the Australian Royal Commission, where 500 priests were found guilty of having abused 8,000 people. And what we saw from the Catholic Church was cover up. They're actually Catholic dioceses because Scientology is actually organizationally based upon the Catholic Church, that every diocese is separately registered. So they're like little compartments. If one of them is picked, the rest doesn't go down. But I'm told that many dioceses have actually gone bankrupt, paying off compensation awards. And we should be, and inside the Catholic Church, there are people who work towards doing something. In the county cult field many years ago, there was the wonderful Kent Bertner, and he gave a talk called People in Glass Houses about the abuse of the Catholic Church. And soon after that, he wasn't a priest anymore.
Yeah, I'm sure. Sure.
So, yeah, it's very dangerous to commit yourself utterly to being directed by anybody outside yourself. The locus of your control should remain with you. And and I think it's one of the reasons that, I wasn't abused and humiliated in Scientology anyway. I wasn't a living member. I wasn't on the staff.
Right.
But it was easier for me to leave because I've always had a quizzical nature. And whenever I saw something that Hubbard had said that didn't make sense, I'd go, that doesn't make sense. I'd have conversations with people about it. I remember a long conversation about Hubbard talking about, he says, some 14th century psychiatrists have done this. And I'm going, it was a handwritten note and the 9's been transposed as a 4. Pretty simple, because there weren't any psychiatrists.
Right.
In the 19th century, the term is invented then. They were called alienists initially. And I had a course supervisor who had a PhD in physics, who was working for NASA. And he wanted to argue with me that Hubbard was right, and that this was actually a reference to Thomas Aquinas's faculty psychology. And you're going, no, psychiatry is the treatment of the mentally ill. Psychology is the understanding of the human mind, and faculty psychology is something altogether different from both of those subjects. But he had to, the demand for purity. Hubbard had to be right. For me, I'd look at something and say, oh, he was in a bad mood when he wrote that.
Yeah, but I think what you just said, that need to be right, I think leads someone down a very uncomfortable path. I mean, obviously, not only is it tied to some ego issues, but that idea that there is an absolute correct way, or that there, again, it comes back to this thing. I mean, you taught me very much about just even the term idealism, and how kind of black and white that is, in the way that when we think of these idealistic concepts, most of them are very black and white and absolute in their approach. And that was so helpful to me to kind of start to recognize it, and then reflect back on, well, how many things do I look at it that way? And certainly that was a large part of the indoctrination when I was, spending, my 20 years in the cult. And but I just see aspects of it all over the place, and you see it in as simply as a personality trait in someone who is definitively wants to be right all the time, and they're not fun people to be around.
Yeah.
Because you can't really have a conversation with someone like that. I knew someone who was just literally loved to argue, but their idea of arguing was, well, no, let me hear what you say. Well, you're wrong. This is the way it is. And that was their idea of arguing. They just knew definitively that they were right. They loved hearing you kind of come out with something else, and they would just reject it emphatically and just say, that's wrong. This is right. And with the assumption that eventually you're going to come over to their point of view. And that was their idea of an argument. And I was like, this isn't not my thing. I don't want to do that.
Yeah. The science fiction writer A. Van Vogt, who actually stopped, he wrote no more after he became involved with Ron Hubbard's Dianetics in 1950. And for the next 35 years, he was a practitioner of his form of the original Dianetics. And I had the great good fortune to communicate with him by letter in the early 80s,
right.
mid 80s. And he had come up with a concept called the right man. People who just cannot be wrong. It's certainly one of the aspects of what is called narcissism. People who, and I mean, there's a phrase for it that George H.W. Bush repeated, which is never apologize. It's a sign of weakness. And it's a really good one to trace back, because the source of this wisdom is John Wayne. In the movie, he wore a yellow ribbon, and the character wants to kill the white woman who's been taken captive by the First Peoples because she's been tainted through contact with them. So that's the guy that comes up with never apologize, it's a sign of weakness. One of the things I do like about Barack Obama is that he was capable of apologizing. And it's a sign of incredible strength to be willing to say, I was wrong about that, and take whatever comes back from that. Whereas the perception of, I have a very good friend who, it doesn't matter what you say. If he slips up in some way, if he gives an erroneous fact, he will then make an elaborate construction as to why he is right. I remember a particular disagreement. I picked him up because, as many people do, he thought the word stricture meant restriction. And it doesn't. It's a criticism of stricture. And I pointed this out, and he then got into this really labyrinthine argument about why it was the right word to use in that context. And it makes life so difficult for everyone.
Yeah.
That we should feel strong enough to apologize. We must feel, that we change our minds.
No, we talk about it all the time. The humility is such a key component, I think, in not only our own self-reflection, obviously, but then just being able to communicate and operate in the world in a way to even really connect to people. I mean, how do you really connect to someone if you can't show some humility? It's a trait that we all obviously all need to gain and work on, but to just run from, I don't think it's going to be a very useful approach.
No, I had the good fortune to spend a few hours with the Archbishop of Crete, Archbishop Irenaeus,
a
conference in St. Petersburg. And when he realized that I was not a Christian, though I'm not against it, he said, well, what do you believe in? And I said, I believe in compassion and I try to show it. And I believe that humility is a good idea. And one day I hope to get some. And he looked at me, he said, humility, everything is humility. And he is one of the few truly chilled out human beings I've met. Just a quite remarkable, gentle, loving human being who had somehow risen to a very high position in the Orthodox Church. I mean, above him, there's the patriarch and then Jesus.
Yeah.
So he's very high up in the hierarchy. But it was interesting to have that confirmed from somebody he was 82 when we met. And he'd been practicing, he was, he practiced what he preached. He would put on an ordinary priest's outfit and go out in the evenings and talk to people, so that people won't be overwhelmed by his regalia, and do what he could to help them. But to see humility at that level, when I was with him, people were coming up and seeking to kiss his ring, which is apparently a normal practice in the Orthodox Church. Not very hygienic, I must say. And he would then pour them a drink of juice or give them some grapes to eat. He related to people on the level. And I think that's another important thing, people who wear their knowledge lightly, people who are not trying to impress you with how clever they are. And, I will get over that at some point.
Yeah. And I think that, in that light, to me, the people that I would probably label the greatest teachers are the ones that seem to simplify things and make it quite easy to understand it and assimilate, rather than the pontificating scientist who just goes on and you just feel like, I don't understand at all what you're saying. And it's all done with the intent to impress you on how smart they are.
Yeah.
But a really great teacher can take something that can be quite a complicated idea and distill it into something that's quite easy to understand and relatable and for you to take in and assimilate and apply in some way. That's a great teacher.
Yes, absolutely. And thankfully in human history there have been a few of them, and who've managed to, I mean, to say I'm not a Christian, but I tremendously admire some of the things that are recorded in the Gospels. One of them is consider the tree by the fruit that it bears. And that's a very useful idea that nice tree, but does it give figs, or can I taste the useful from it?
I think it's great.
Right. Well,
I think we've covered quite a lot here today.
I think we've done our job reasonably well today. So thank you very much. We'll
my pleasure as always, John. It's always a treat, and I always come away from these things not only grateful for our friendship, but thought provoked and humbled in the opportunity to have the conversation. So it's great.
Yeah, the same is true for me, that it's always a stimulating experience. So, and let's hope that anybody who's managed to watch this far has also found it stimulating.
Yes, let's hope so. And thank you if you are watching. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Hi, John here. Thanks for watching. We'd appreciate it very much if you would click like, as well as subscribe, and click the bell for notifications. Every dollar helps, and we welcome new patrons on Patreon, or you can make a one-off payment with any currency through PayPal. Thanks so much. Let's get Mark Zuckerberg out of this conversation immediately.